Welcome to the Rated PG podcast, hosted by Peter Grunberg.
Good evening, Budapest. This is Peter Grunberg. I have been invited by my long-term friend, Ray Brown, and this is Budapest FM, and we are convening for a conversation about the Ukraine. We don't profess to be experts in any shape or form, but this conversation will perhaps give you some insights into what we have been thinking and doing within our community. In future, I'll be inviting friends and guests who are experts in a variety of things to join me on conversations on a whole range of topics, which I hope you find engaging and interesting. Stay tuned. I had a conversation with a chap from CNN recently who's doing a reportage on that, and we'll see how that comes out. But he recorded it last weekend in fact, and that'll be coming out soon. And I think the message there is basically lots of little micro steps that were taken, and when the whole thing kicked off, which is, I think most people, me included, I'm sure you felt the same, it was absolutely not expected. It didn't seem real. It was like, it's been in the papers, it's just bluster, but actually when it kicked off, it was slightly hard to believe that was actually happening. Anyway, the reason I mentioned that was then the quick reaction was, what on earth can you do as quickly as possible with things and tools to your immediate disposal? And that was something I talked about with this fellow Charlie from CNN, and micro efforts, whilst the big wheels of the NGOs and the big agencies and the people who do these things professionally, they take time to get moving.
When it kicked off, what was the initial we were in the position where we saw that Putin was about to invade two of the provinces of the Ukraine, and they made it sound like that was the only places they were going to go to. Did you know?
I didn't know a thing.
Okay.
Or did you? I guess I sort of, in a romantic, slightly optimistic way, thought, that can't be possible. He's not going to do it. You can obviously, but you're thinking in a way that is presumably very different from the way he does. So I wouldn't know anything different from what you do or anyone else does. But I did speak with friends who are political scientists and would be better versed in these things, and they said, well, we're reading the same news feeds as you are. And so therefore, there was a concern then, thinking, what on earth does one, I think when it did kick off,
right,
and the reality kicked in, then people were sort of sprung into action, and particularly in Budapest actually was when we could see there were friends of friends, and because of the proximity of Hungary to Ukraine obviously, then friends had contacts or extended family or whatever else, and so they were like, my God, can you somehow help? These are people who might be living further afield in the UK or the States.
Gotcha. So
that was the first cry for
I see your wine over there. Let me grab my wine real quick too.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's a subject that probably needs it. So.
Wow, man. Yeah. So you guys. So basically, Brody or you and Will. I don't want to drink all this stuff. Brody, you and Will, and actually decided from the point that someone made the suggestion that we should do something.
Absolutely. Well, actually, I think firstly, Will and me being the first we were speaking and thinking, what on earth do we do? And he actually very quickly posted something on Facebook. It was a WTF question. How can we help? Who can we help? Give us a shout. It was literally just an open call for people out there. And then that message landed very quickly. And people from, as I said, from the States or UK, who were obviously not very proximate, said, well, actually, I've got a friend who could really do with a bit of help. They're trying to get out of Ukraine, and they will come to Budapest, would probably be a logical first point for them, depending on where they were. So the first person actually, well, there's a couple of people, but the first person that I got to meet and got to know was a chap called Alexei, who was a filmmaker in Ukraine.
Is that the guy that I...
Yeah, you met him, exactly.
Yeah? Okay.
Yeah. Charming fellow. He's worked on international productions. And
he's been here before then?
Yes, he has been to Budapest. He's quite widely travelled. But he was a good example of, through the friend network, he was actually working elsewhere, and he wasn't in Ukraine. So he then had a particularly anxious...
Oh, that explains it. Because I was wondering, like when I saw him, I was like, how did he get out of the country being the age that he was when they weren't letting men?
Well, exactly. So he was actually out doing some work. And so his then chief objective was, of course, to get his wife and 2 small children and just reunite with them. And so that was one example of the sort of the friend circle and the network. People saying, right, somehow help this guy and get his wife across. And anyway, that was one of a few very direct examples. And fortunately, we found accommodation for him. We actually put him in one of our own apartments, and then a friend of his. So the whole community pulled together. His wife came through with the children. They missed the train. Someone helped. I mean, it was obviously chaotic to say the least, but it was an example of the kind of people that came onto the radar very quickly. That was a sort of a happier example, of course, because that family's been reunited, and they've now sort of semi-settled in Budapest and building a life here.
Wow.
But then we had friends who were saying, well, my aged aunt and my grandmother, or, who's been living there and is reluctant to move, that requires some cajoling. And then once they were here, then how could we help them with their onward transit to, well, in one particular case, to New York? So, it was counter examples. But once that started rolling, this is within the first 24, 48 hours, right?
Wow.
And then we had friends who went to the border that picked people up and said they've now got some people who just have no idea where they're going to go. They just need a safe space.
And picking them up at the border, have you been to the border? I
haven't been to the border.
I haven't either. Yeah.
No, I've been to the train stations, all that kind of thing. But Will made a couple of trips to the border.
Did he?
Yep. Well, I think firstly, I was out of Budapest when it all kicked off. I then came back. I was in Austria. And then when I returned, then we sort of sprung into action with getting some sort of operational base ready here. And so whilst people were zooming up and down to the border, we collected provisions. And I think what we tried to do, rightly or wrongly, I mean, who knows, but good intentions at least, was to see how can we best apply effort. I think it's very easy that everyone runs around, with the best intention, of course, but a lot of people running in parallel doing the same kind of thing. And so I thought, well, how can we now start to take a bit of a step back and say, well, what do we need? How can we make this more impactful? How can we coordinate our various efforts? So the first thing that I did was to set up WhatsApp groups with all these kind, friendly people. I think you're probably on it. But and that, I think, at least was some marshalling of effort, and that worked quite well insofar as people would say, well, look, I've got a family here, but I don't have accommodation. Or someone would say, actually, I have some accommodation offer, but I don't have someone identified to provide that accommodation for. So there was a bit of a match of supply and demand of willingness to do things.
Wow.
And then we built a little database and just try to systematize things a little bit. I mean, it was still
take the skill sets
chaotic,
that you have and the resources you have to...
Well, yeah, and it was basically community being the main thing. So if someone, there's language skills, and there were people who would be willing to, and actually qualified to provide therapeutic services, and we could sort of bring them into the mix somehow. And then ultimately space. And I think that's perhaps where we were able to marshal ourselves into providing the right kind of thing. So it could be spare beds in Brody House, for example, or apartments, either ones that we had vacant or other people had. And that was, I think, seen as the first priority. I mean, it's a hierarchy of needs stuff, with Maslow. I mean, it's shelter, it's food, it's basic stuff. And then more recently, we've got the workshop into action.
Wow, I didn't realize this. I thought the workshop was the beginning. I didn't know that.
That was then seen as, I think, once we sort of filled beds and suddenly people had roofs over their heads, that at least that we're within our network or friends of friends, as I said, But then clearly that's just a very small group of people, really. And then, of course, you had the Facebook groups popping up, and there were quite a lot of very sensible initiatives that were set up here where people could find something. But of course, the numbers were unpredictable, and more people came through. So, I mean, it's still the case, obviously.
Yeah.
And then the workshop fitted insofar as we had a space that could be used for the provision of breakfast and lunch, and we could get that up and running. And we had some really
internet, and they can use the internet to interact. And
well, the key thing exactly was then, once you've got your lodging, you've got some source of food. I mean, the Ukraine Culture Center was excellent. They're down the road on Paulere.
I didn't know that there was a Ukraine Culture Center.
I have to confess, I didn't either until a few weeks ago.
On the same street.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So it's 200-300 meters away.
That's amazing.
And that came to my attention just because of one of our friends who had themselves left Kyiv, and it was a couple, an English fellow and a Ukrainian lady, and they had come through. And we'd been connected by a friend in Vienna who just said, by the way, I know this fellow, look out for him. And he duly connected us. And they're charming and capable, and they sprung into action with a view to then
That's awesome.
setting up a team.
Wow.
Coordinating the volunteer team that we were sort of in a hodgepodge way putting together.
Are they Hungarians or?
No, so he's English.
Okay.
And he was working for a company.
Gotcha.
And his
Cheers
partner.
to them.
Right. Oh, well,
My gosh.
I don't mind mentioning names. Basically, Josh and Anna.
Josh and
they
Anna.
are.
Cheers to Josh and Anna.
Yeah,
My
absolutely.
gosh. Wow.
So Josh is, I think their story is fantastic. And actually, Anna was interviewed a number of times with CNN and these other news channels, and she spoke very movingly about her own journey, and she's been through it.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, her task was then to make sure that her family was safe while she had managed to get to Budapest. So she was coordinating that, and at the same time supporting people who'd made over to Budapest. So she had her hands full.
Yeah.
Massive respect for that, and she was very much a real trooper, to say the very least.
Actually, on a side note, just to let folks know, since we have this visual camera, these have nothing to do with this particular podcast that's happening here.
Yeah,
we're becoming quite serious about this, but just to let you know that these are from another show. Okay, so I'm going to pull these to the side. So, well, no, I'll just leave them here. You already seen them, so it doesn't matter. Right. But occasionally, if I touch it, it's because I'm not thinking. Right, so forgive us.
It's your anxiety. Yeah, exactly. Your stress ball, right?
You can call it that.
So yeah, I didn't want to descend too deeply into a subject. Of course, everyone's been examining very thoroughly, but I think it'd be remiss not to talk about that and reflect on that. And it's obviously all-consuming. But I think the obvious subjects, when's it going to end? What are the implications? What's the where's it going to go?
It's a real war.
There's no point. Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, we've never, at least not in my lifetime, have experienced a war so close to me. Like, I mean, we could, have you been to the Ukraine? Have you been to
I have actually. Yeah. A few years ago, quite a few years ago, to Kyiv.
Oh, okay.
And just a long.
I've always wanted to go.
It's great.
Yeah.
And so I hate to think what it's like now, but I've obviously seen images on the news, clearly. But it was charming people. It was pretty happening. There's a lot of stuff going on. I had real energy, and so it's clearly a city that was developing and growing. And it goes without saying they had aspirations to move in a different direction.
Did you have Ukrainian friends here during?
I've developed some recently, yeah, absolutely.
But prior to the event?
Prior to that, not that were native. I mean, people with that Ukrainian heritage, shall we say?
Okay.
But not actually. Well, there was one. Yeah, I mean, there was one. There's one or two living in London, for example.
Okay.
But they've been living there for quite a long time.
Yeah, I was trying to think if I had known. I mean, I'm sure I must have. But I don't. It doesn't really. I don't know, and I don't know. It's just strange. I had actually. There's a band that's performing, and they do these live streams. They perform, and I forget what city that they're in. And I reached out to them like maybe before my trip to Brazil, and I said, look, if you guys need anything, if you need, me to stream your stream, just send me the RMPT code or whatever, and I'll send it to all of our multi-streams on our side. And I didn't hear from him for like a week, 2 weeks, and then I got this message saying, yeah, we'd totally be interested in that. So
Okay.
yeah. So I mean, that's the only connection I have with that. But
Yeah, and I mean, now I'm thinking about it, I know a few people who've got a parent that might be Ukrainian. There's a couple in Budapest, and I said there's one or two in London. But yeah, I don't have a huge number of Ukrainian friends, but now I do, and I think from what I can, the people I've met, I've been amazed at how, firstly, stoic they are, and we can't begin to imagine how they must feel.
And it's mostly like women and children that must be coming through. I mean, there's no men.
No.
Yeah.
I mean, that's sadly.
No men. I mean, that's like, it scares me.
Yeah.
It scares me because I keep hearing the stats, I mean, you don't know if they're true or not, but I'm sure, it's got to be, they're trying to figure out what's happening. But they're I mean, I don't know. I don't even like to. I don't even want to talk about that actually, because I don't even, unless I know what's actually happening in that space, it's hard to talk about those things. I mean, you just hope the best for the Ukrainian men that are there and the ones that are trying to help in that process. Like, what are they that they're able to survive this and that it comes to an end as quickly as possible. I know there's Russians that I've met on the outskirts of this process, and they feel ashamed of what's happening. Guys, people that I met like in restaurants and clubs, just going out to some of the restaurants here.
Yeah, I think that's the other obviously uncomfortable subject will be, it must be very difficult if you are Russian and you probably don't agree with this. And you're going to be,
Or if they're on the,
I guess you'll be sort of besmirched just by association.
Yeah.
And,
well, they're on the, anyone on the outside knows what's really happening, and anyone on the inside.
Yeah. So that's another issue, and I think one has to be sympathetic towards people who are, the artists and musicians and dancers and people who just creative people who don't have a political agenda, and so that's something which
just normal people.
Yeah, absolutely, and
workers.
Yeah. No, and there's a number of Russians that I know in Budapest, for example, and they clearly are not feel awful about this, and they've been helping, they've been volunteering. Yeah. I mean, there's a language element which they share, and they've been helping on that front. So
inside your
absolutely inside this sort of the community or the network, if you like, for want of a better word. But yeah, absolutely. So, and of course, people recognise that, and I hope they don't get tainted by association.
Okay.
But clearly, not very comfortable either way. But perhaps talking on some concrete things. So, is I think what sort of our network has been doing. I've seen very active people, and from, as I said, from the transporting element to the housing to providing food to potentially creating employment opportunities. I mean, that's probably a longer down the track because immediate concerns are obviously survival. And I've met, I'm sure you have too, people who've just come out with nothing and literally just left with a phone and may not even have taken a passport with them, depending on the circumstance under which they left. But yeah, that's not uncommon.
Yeah. Well, that's another issue thing about having your show or just having the podcast in general is that you never know whose ears is hearing that information and wants to help.
Absolutely. Very true. And I think that's perhaps one of the things that we've been trying to communicate is to, in our very small way, and no, you've been doing the same, but is really directing that. I think that there's a lot of really wonderful organizations that are kicking into action here, and the one I've mentioned already, but I'm amazed by how they've gone about it. It's the Ukraine Culture Center. That's the one it's actually on Paulede. It's on the corner of Paulede and Hajoszutca.
Okay.
So it's in the middle of 6th District, downtown Budapest. And they're all volunteers. There were suddenly they have other jobs, and now they've made basically a logistics center for the collection of provisions. And they come out with a list. In fact, I've got one in front of me here. And they quite sensibly said, well, what do they actually need? And they're getting information from the border and other colleagues who are maybe even in Ukraine saying, well, here is what is actually specifically required.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that they established quite early on was that lots of kind people just wanted to give things, but it's better if it's done in accordance with what's actually needed. And certainly they didn't want to appear ungrateful, but they did also want to make sure that those efforts were well directed. And so that's, I think, just one good example of a small organization that's gone about things.
What are the things that they need?
Yeah, well, this current list, you can hear me turning the pages, of course. I mean, it's changed in nature.
I can see you turn the pages too.
Oh yeah, there's that too. Well, it started off with children's toys and clothing and bedding and that sort of thing, and now it's moved to more medical supplies, actually, which is a sad reflection of what's going on. And so the kind of things which they need, and if there are people who
are there people coming in wounded by the war as well? Because you say medical supplies, like or
but these would then be, as far as I have seen it. So we've bought a few things, taken them there, and then they are then taken from the centre in Budapest to the border, or even beyond and into the country.
Okay.
So they have a kind of a relay system that they've conceived. So they recognise that there are people in Budapest who are generous and have got some ability to donate. So that's, I think, the process that that's at least the initial process. Now, of course, the big agencies will be kicking in, but this was from day one. But they're still collecting things. I think they're fairly well supplied, but
how is it? How difficult is it to? I mean, are there like Ukrainians on the border side that are doing? Are they doing passport checks before you come in? I mean, how is that process like organized even at the border, from people that are official to those that are completely unofficial?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know. I think it's probably crossing from Ukraine into Budapest, I think, is taking some time. So there's clearly an immigration process that needs to be served. So,
but getting these things,
I think that's I think they obviously have to go through border controls.
So it's a process.
Yeah,
it's not a quick process.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I haven't done that, but one would hope that delivering boxes of medical equipment would be expedited.
Exactly, especially if there's an individual that hits the border constantly to deliver these things. They get used to seeing that face, that image, that person.
Yeah, I mean, let's hope that is the case.
Yeah.
But they do seem to be. They've got a system. Okay. They've got quite large trucks, and certainly every time I've gone down there to take some stuff, they have an awful lot of people who are human chain relaying boxes. It's all packed up. They've got their inventories. So it does look pretty systematic.
I got a friend of mine who actually has a podcast here at Budapest FM, and he's an American guy who's been living here, learning the language, and he decided to start his own campaign to fundraise, and I think he's raised probably $30,000 US at this point, and he's been going to the border back and forth quite a bit. That would be an interesting question to pose to him on what is that process look and feel like.
Absolutely, and indeed, he may also have an insight into what's needed, and maybe he's the sort of person. There you go, is a good example of how we could link him with the Ukraine Culture Center, and go, well, here's someone who's got some funds. I think these guys are reliant on provisions being donated, and maybe they can then have a larger truck. There's a logic perhaps there. I mean, it sounds like he's jumped into it very quickly and effectively.
Yeah. He's just taken the reins.
Yeah,
which is do it.
Amazing, and I think that there's been quite a lot of people doing that in Budapest.
Cheers to Willie. His name is
Willie. Okay, right.
Willie.
Okay. Well, cheers
Walking
to Willie.
with Willie was his old show.
This is
Willie.
Right. Okay. Well done, Willie. So that's another example of the kind of responses that people have adopted.
How can people help? I mean, like from your perspective, if you were just to say, from what you're doing now, what are the things that you look for, Brody looks for, what Peter looks for, what Will looks for to, assist at this moment in time?
Sure. I think if you asked me 3 or 4 weeks ago, I would have said, if you've got spare rooms in apartments, because that seems to be acutely needed. I don't know whether this is reflective of the situation. I don't have any stats to support this, but it does seem, and a few people have mentioned the same thing, that the sheer volume of people looking for apartments in Budapest seems to be, or at least the request that we're fielding, seems to have died off a little bit. People do come into our space and typically don't have anything set up, but that's, and we found, or someone in our community has managed to find homes for everybody that I'm aware of. Now, I think today, looking at there's probably a couple of things. Firstly, some people are actually looking for work, and that seems to be an increasing request. And I've heard many people, certainly within our ecosystem, if you like, who are reluctant just to take arms and just rely on charity. And they have skills. They either, we've come across engineers or people who are web designers or filmmakers and so on. One lady is a psychotherapist, and so these are smart, educated, trained people, and they want to get on their feet and get working.
Right.
So I imagine there would be, if there are companies who have the opportunity or have the ability to recruit, then I think that's where people should think about making available spaces, recruiting people, giving them actual jobs, not just for the sake of it, if indeed that's possible. So I think that's one thing, that somehow to coordinate that actually could be a project in itself, where someone creates a portal. There are these initiatives and there are sites around, so they may already exist and may be satisfactory, but I've just seen a few. But I think that certainly with our network, shall we say, of people with SME, small companies or medium-sized companies that are willing to create opportunities for people to then stay in Budapest for longer than just a few days or weeks. That's probably quite a useful thing to do. We
got to get those people in the room here to have these conversations, to either from the standpoint of what they do, individuals and what they do, to the people that can actually sustain or to hopefully put these two sides together.
Yeah. Well, key word is sustain. I think that's one thing that's popped out, that people want to be sustaining themselves.
100%. If they're asking for jobs and not a handout, clearly.
Absolutely.
Clearly.
And I think one has to have a huge respect for that.
Yeah.
And one can understand that too.
Right.
So I think that's probably something where some thought needs to be given to how one creates, whether it's a platform or a little portal, a very simple tool that would enable, certainly on a network level. There are EU sites, and there's probably much more substantial, but there's probably quite a bit of bureaucracy and maybe hard to find. Where do you start? Whereas if they're a smaller scale potentially, and it's a bit like, I suppose, in the way that we went about finding accommodation for people, you may be a bit more tailor-made, and that might be able to help a smaller group of people. It may not be it may not be thousands of people you could help in that way. So I don't know. I haven't really thought that through, but that's certainly something through recent conversations, that as people, the ones that we've spoken to, some have very clear onward transit plans, and want to go to Germany, Spain, and the UK. So we've connected them with various people who may be able to help with that. So that's just a question of time, and some people have a very clear view of how they want to do that. Either have family that already exist in those places, or friends that are willing to sponsor them. But others may not have those connections or those links.
Do you have people coming in to your world, like workshop or apartments, whatever, daily? Or it's daily?
Yeah, I think for the last, shall we say, 3-4 weeks, whatever it is, the workshop's been acting as a sort of safe space. So actually, that's the purpose of the workshop now. It's a safe space. It's open during working hours, so 9 till 5, Monday to Friday, and on Saturday between 10 and 4. So people come, they have breakfast, and then lunch tends to be pretty busy. And then there's a little child area where people can have kids play, and there's some educators there that come in and hopefully give the mums a little bit of respite. They can then get online. We've got some computers that we've made available, so people aren't just working on their phones, which of course, not very easy to book your onward travel and get visas sorted out and whatever else. Quite a lot of bureaucratic work needs to be done.
And language-wise, how's the language barrier?
It depends. I mean, we've got quite a number of volunteers who are both English and Ukrainian speaking or Russian. So, yeah, that they've managed to help. I think the vast majority of people have found someone that can help them.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's amazing what you're doing, Peter, over there. I mean, really. I mean, it's to find a solution to an issue that's larger than any of us. I mean, definitely me has ever experienced.
Sure, and I think it's all we're trying to do is, throw our shoulder to the wheel. There's many people doing the same thing.
Shoulder to the wheel.
Yeah.
I've never heard that one.
No? Okay.
I like
think it's
that.
a nice phrase, actually. It's the etymology of that. I don't know what the etymology of that is, actually. Clearly, it must be some sort of Roman concept of, lots of people
Shoulder
pushing
to the
it.
wheel. Actually, it doesn't mean literally. It means strength.
Yeah, I think actually, yes, exactly. It's basically moving something forwards.
Yeah, I like that.
So
shoulder to the wheel.
I'm curious what people. Maybe someone can actually tell us. I could Google it, but I sort of like to try and see if I can remember. It might come into my mind, but yeah. So I think a lot of people putting their shoulder to the wheel to make that happen.
Yeah.
And
including you.
Yeah, including us. But there's many people involved in that, and there's been a wonderful lady from Morgan Stanley. It's called Bonnie. Bonnie has been an absolute whirlwind, a dervish of positive energy. And so she has been doing also things like fundraising. She's got food.
We got to get her in here.
Absolutely. Well, funny enough, I tried to call Bonnie earlier, thinking she'd be a good person to speak to, but she's got, unfortunately, she's been laid low by something, nasty bug, and
it's been hitting people around lately.
Yeah, I think there's colds and bugs and stuff going around.
Right before spring, it always happens. Like right when it kicks in summer.
Yeah. So anyway, so she's sort of kept a low profile last couple of days, but I mean she's top notch. So I think we'll speak with her at some point.
Yeah,
and, if we as a group were a bit more substantial, then we try and poach her. But I think Morgan Stanley have got their hold on her.
Oh yeah, I'm sure.
Slightly different.
I'm sure.
Different situation.
I believe the having the conversation, or at least having real people talking about real issues, as opposed to it being on paper or an email or fetched in some or I don't want to knock out the networks and all that stuff, but we're here. I mean, we're actually physically here, and we see people coming in. You see what is actually happening, what they're talking about, what they're feeling, and this is what I believe people respond to that want to help.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, there's a couple other friends of mine who I think warrant mention, and one is a chap called Adam Parker, who's a photographer, and he's a very humble and very talented man. But in this case, he's sprung into action extremely quickly, and his longtime partner actually is Ukrainian, and so their first objective was to help her family,
100%.
Who were obviously on the wrong side of the border. And they managed to get to Romania, or the Romanian border, and so he flew there and helped them with finding accommodation. And then it extended beyond her family and some of their friends and nephews and nieces and so on. So he was highly active, all under his own steam, a bit like the fellow that you mentioned, Willie
Everts.
Yeah, and so Adam was there. He got medical supplies and food, and he rented a couple of apartments for longer term so people could have a base there. And then he managed to facilitate transfer to the UK for a few people, and some went to Spain and so on.
There's some heroes, huh?
So yeah, he was right in there, and so he was part of our WhatsApp group.
Okay.
And the information that he was relaying was quite helpful. So then other people connected and thought, oh, hang on a minute, I've got some friends in that part of Ukraine. So he was able to give them some fairly useful information about how they could navigate their way to potentially a less constrained part of the border. And that I think he achieved quite a lot that way. And there's another friend of mine as well, a chap called Chris Timms, who's a Chris Timms. Yeah, he is an English teacher, but he was supposed to be taking a sabbatical with his Polish wife, and they had been renovating some apartments in I can't remember the
Here
town.
in Budapest?
No, in Poland. It's a little
okay.
Pretty close to the border actually.
Oh wow!
And anyway, they were getting to sort of towards the end of that project, and then when this kicked off, so suddenly his sabbatical has changed. But he's been highly involved in helping people similarly, providing their apartments for accommodation purposes, and he's been running to and fro, and he's been helping as well with some of the bureaucratic elements because he speaks pretty good Polish and his wife is indeed Polish. So I think they've helped not only find people and get people into a safe environment, and then work out the next steps, which of course is pretty challenging as to visas and what next and where do people go? And, all those kind of questions, which are secondary but not exactly straightforward. So, there are two examples of people who've dived straight in there and done an awful lot. So, of course, the list is long, but those are two ones I think particularly want to bring to your attention.
Wow. Peter.
But other actions, and I guess we can probably move on to another subject. I didn't want to dominate that.
No,
but it's
that is the subject.
What is the subject? Right, okay. Well,
I mean...
so actually Adam, now I mentioned him, he's setting up an auction in London. So he's back in London now, and he set up an art auction with, and there's actually a WhatsApp group. I can see it's pinging messages quite frequently.
How many WhatsApp groups do you think you've accumulated since this?
Oh my goodness. There's quite a few actually, now you mention it. Yeah. So he set up something called Art Aid. And so they're point of doing little logos, and it's all in the planning stage at this point. But I think they've set a date for the middle of April. I think it might actually even be the Easter weekend or the weekend after. Anyway, I'll come back to you on that. But they're getting together a group of artists to donate work, some quite known artists too. And this will be taking place in a central London venue. So they're planning it right now, and I think they might even have a call. I think they're even having a Zoom call as we speak.
Oh wow!
And so that's just another example of an initiative that I think is fantastic, and where we can then make more people available or aware of this rather, and of course they can buy artwork, create funding. I mean, ultimately, funding is a pretty major part of the solution.
I know I got to figure out how to get NFTs involved in that whole process. Every time you talk about art, I think about NFTs, and there must be some way to connect the dots if somebody hasn't already, especially here in Budapest.
I think there has been some.
Has there? Okay.
I think there been some active. I don't know whether these guys are doing it, and maybe they will, but for sure that'll be. I seem to
easier way to transfer funds from point A to point B.
Well. Absolutely. And I guess crypto, I mean, maybe we can sort of move on. Now I can drive.
No. Actually, quite honestly, I mean, I think, you've made some serious points in what you've talked about at this point, really.
Yes, I thank you. And I want to get some of those points across. And, we can come back to that, and there'll be, newsletters and mail outs and social media communication, and we'll continue with that.
Do you have any funds? Did you have did you set up, what are ways through your organizations that people can?
Yeah, well, we did look at setting up a foundation, but it takes some time to do that.
Gotcha.
And so we've just gone the usual route with the Gofundme. So Bonnie, the lady I mentioned earlier, she set up a Gofundme campaign. They're quite well known. People are familiar with these things. I think they're fairly well controlled. I mean, there's a cost, but there's a reason for that. And my sister also set up so that's in the States, and then my sister set one up in the UK, Just Giving, which
Just
is again,
Giving, okay.
a well-known platform, and people are familiar with that. It's pretty easy, and you just use your credit card and off you go. So
Cheers to your sister.
yeah, to my sister and Bonnie, exactly.
Yes, and Bonnie.
And Bonnie, yeah. No, they jumped into that pretty quickly. So, so those are the ways that, in terms of people donating funds, but also where a lot of people have been very helpful. A chap called Richard Logg, one person to mention, and Peter Bombelt as well. These are people who live in Budapest, and they've been buying food for us and helping. So very much part of this collective action.
Beautiful.
I keep coming back to.
Beautiful.
Wow. And yeah, another friend of mine in the UK, Roger Kelly. So I should give people shouts. And yeah, he's sent over a couple of laptops.
Oh wow!
There's a few more coming.
I
tomorrow.
love it. Wow.
So I think it's this.
Yeah,
community action.
Real people caring.
Yeah, so we haven't raised a huge amount of money at all, but we're either using our own resources, space, food, etc., or other people have been, bringing things to mix. I mean, it kind of makes me think of there's a Hungarian proverb actually, or parable actually, it's called Körleves.
Yeah, I'm gonna push that next to you. Yeah.
Anyway, and I'll probably misquote this or scramble it, but as I understand it and I recall, there's a parable about a village and they're running short of bits and pieces, and they're like, how on earth are we going to feed the village? And to paraphrase, and someone will no doubt correct and get it right, but one person chucked in a tomato, another one chucked in an onion, and so on, and so therefore the end result was that the collaborative components served to make this kind of Körleves, a stone soup. I'm not sure where the stone bit comes from. I'm probably missing a detail, but I think
the stone was heating.
Maybe the stone was in there. Exactly, as a hot stone. We can find that out. But the message, which I think is the key piece, which is this idea of collaboration, that everyone chucks a little piece in. So they may not have enough of the components to make their own soup, but if they all throw their little piece in, suddenly you have got a soup which actually serves to feed everybody. And I think that's probably quite a useful thought and quite applicable in this instance.
Back to basics.
Right.
It's beautiful. I think it's needed. These kind of I think it's kind of like the concept of a death in the family, and everybody comes to the funeral and they come together, and this is the one time that they actually connect, and it's sometimes tragedy, and this is tragic. I don't want to talk like it's not, and it continues to be tragic, and we must do everything we can to help people in this space. But it brings people that maybe didn't even realize how heartfelt they would feel about situations, and bring them all in one place that would never be in the same room and never help and never be, And
I think that's very true, and certainly a lot of commentary in the news. And I'm looking at my various messages coming through. So sorry, excuse me.
No, it's okay. No, it's real.
I guess, yeah.
It's real.
And yes, exactly. So people are understanding there's a kind of a mission, purpose type of thing, and then people maybe realise the trivialities of things that might have been irritated by.
Right.
Me included. Okay, really, I gave airtime to that subject. Why on earth did I waste my time on that when these things are going on? So cliche as it may sound, but I think that's probably, if we're grasping as we are grasping for something to positive to hold on to in this situation, then I think it is at least the way people are rallying together, the way people are connecting, the way people are collaborating, and perhaps letting go of things that really don't warrant getting annoyed by 100%. Or irritated by. So
I hope it's a reset. Yeah,
maybe it's exactly. So compassion reset, or however one wants to look at it. So obviously, be nice if people did that without having a tragedy that precipitates this.
Yeah.
But that's one thing to perhaps.
How are your kids processing? Like your son and daughter. I mean, how do you? They're very intelligent kids. I mean, they're like I'm just curious about the questions they ask you.
Well, of course, it's a big subject. I mean, they're small, so they're 7 and 9 respectively. And the idea of, war is just something they don't really get. I mean, apart from toy soldiers and stuff, that's basically it. So they did, of course. I think I sensed for the first few days, actually, particularly the older one, just seemed a little bit off and seemed bothered. And so, we sat down and talked about it. And he was obviously preoccupied because obviously he's hearing things, and it's inevitable that there's news. People talking about adults talking about stuff. They pick up on things. So, I just tried to break it down in a simple fashion. And there was some quite good guidance coming out of schools, and I read a few. Friends of mine were sharing some literature which I thought was useful. That was how you present these things to a child without, of course, making overloading to the point when they become more anxious about it. But at the same time, reality is reality, and so I thought we do need at least give them a sense of what's going on, give them some perspective, but without overloading. I don't know if I got that right, but
do they have electronic? Do they check to the internet? I mean, do they have ways of looking at the internet on their own, or
No, I mean they're pretty small.
Okay.
I mean they do have devices, but they have controls on on the internet, for example.
Yeah.
So I don't think they've been exposed to that, because otherwise that I think is potentially it's too much for them.
Yeah, of course.
I mean, of course, there's plenty of children coming out of refugee children who've seen it and of that age, and that's horrific that they have to experience these things firsthand and leave their parents and fathers particularly behind. But I think certainly for children that are here, you just got to inform them as best you can. I think what I also have done, I've brought them along to on the weekends, for example. They volunteered. I've taken them to the workshop, for example, where they can chat with other kids, because they actually speak Russian on account of their mum.
They do?
Yep.
Oh, wow.
Their mother.
That's right. I forgot about that.
So that was they could use. It's a good tool. They could use that in a nice way, and they could speak with the kids.
Oh, that's beautiful.
So there were some sweet moments. They could play chess with them, for example, and
that is so amazing.
So I think that was, whilst of course the reasons for doing that were I'm not sure they really fully grasped it, other than just as a broad terms. But when they could see little kids there and they connected with them, and I think that sort of perhaps brought it home to them and made them realise that they're fortunate, and these poor kids, therefore, they should be nice to them and do their thing.
That's amazing. That's amazing. I didn't even think about that.
Yeah.
Wow.
But I think there's lots of schools that I'm aware of that have that are recruiting Ukrainian-speaking teachers. There's one school particularly that I've been made aware of. That's the Real School, and they've actually got open days on Saturdays. So so that's where Alexei, this filmmaker I mentioned to you, he was in touch with them. I connected them with, actually, and he's now, I think, been going to some of these Saturday school functions.
And for what reason?
Well, just that they obviously children, their education has been interrupted, and so the Real School, being one that's particularly active, has created a Saturday school opportunities for kids that can't necessarily come.
No, I mean the guy who.
He's got 2 kids.
Oh, he has 2 kids. Okay,
yeah.
I see.
So they're, what are they? They're 5 and 8, if I remember rightly.
I see.
So he wanted to make sure they have some sort of educational opportunities. So there are some good examples, and certainly practical things. Children still need to learn.
Yeah.
And so the list goes on.
Yeah. From a kid's eyes.
Absolutely.
Peter, I think we can end it there.
Yeah.
What do you think?
All right. Well, maybe we can, what I perhaps wanted to do. So we can end it there. But what I perhaps I could tee up for future is, one of the thoughts I was thinking about, and precipitated in part by ongoing events, is thinking about people whom I'd like to talk to, I haven't spoken to for a while, or in different parts of the world. How do they feel? How are they processing this situation? And not to necessarily keep obsessing about this subject, but certainly as a way of connecting with some interesting people, hearing their stories. This is potentially a conduit to sort of ask them how they feel, what's their view, what have they done. That might be the preamble. And then, at the right time, moving the conversation onto other subjects, which may or may not be of interest. And it could be NFTs, it could be ecological questions. I made a trip recently to Paraguay to have a look at some forestry projects that family are involved in. And that, of course, is a big subject in itself. I know it's something that's close to your heart, but the idea, what on earth do we do about the ecological impact or the ecological problems that the world is facing? And that's a big subject, and I really was interested to get my head around that and canvass a few people's views on what they're doing, and that might be of interest.
Yeah, 100%. Wow.
So perhaps that's the segue into the next episode, shall we say, or episodes, is mapping out some of the subjects. And I think it's ecological. I think there can be some a continuation of this discussion, of course, but maybe speaking with people with projects that I think would be worth amplifying and really giving them the airtime, and to tell you a bit about what they're doing. And all sorts of
real life
type subjects.
Real people, real life, real activities in 2022.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then I also want to tease out some things about, you're very reticent and very modest, but tease out about your musical heritage and skills.
Oh,
and
yeah. Well, yeah.
There's lots of stories there. And then we can even eventually reminisce about some of the things we've done in Budapest together.
100%. We have to do that.
Yeah.
Oh, we have to. I mean, we've... I'm even afraid to even start talking about it now because it can go into like a whole different thing. But I mean, you were as far as the whole Brody world or what have you, you were my first encounter.
Yeah, well, that's something I'd obviously, we should bring Will in, talk about that. And it's one of the projects, or one of the things that we've been thinking about. How on earth do we reflect and relate to some of these sort of little cameos, shall we say, in stories, and that's a project in itself. So we should definitely we'll
have to.
I'll
Look,
I'll bring him in.
Podcast to me is like an opportunity for something that is talked about on your mic, my mic, with the cameras running, that 100 years from now, when your great-grandkids or great-great-grandkids happen to find themselves on the internet and they're searching for you, get an opportunity to see and hear something that happened in 2022 that you can't read, or you may read about, and it may be factual, it may not be factual. But one thing for sure,
if the internet still exists, of course.
I'm sorry?
If the internet still exists.
Oh, the internet will always exist.
There's another.
And the servers that I have this on, I've paid for the next 100 years.
Oh, well, then it better do.
Oh, it will. I mean, if electricity exists, the internet exists.
Yeah. Sure. And I think there's one of the things that you've mentioned, and there's perhaps as a closing thought, is documenting and recording stuff.
It's imperative.
The joy that one gets by finding an old book with old photos from years back is like rediscovering a little secret. And I wonder, and I think that's probably your logic, but I suspect that people may well have the same feeling when they find audio files or...
Can you imagine if you had from your great-grandfather something rather than a picture that was recreated to try to prepare or repair the picture that was so old that you had to take it to a shop to get them to Photoshop it?
Well, funnily enough, actually, they my uncle had made I kind of stitched together a bunch of little, I think they were called cine films. So these old little black and white, what are they called? Sort of.
Oh yeah. I forget the name of it. Yeah.
Anyway, and so little handheld devices recording, and black and white with invariably no sound.
Wow.
And so there are pictures or little shorts that he's taken, or little vignettes almost, of when my grandfather was jumping in the car for 2 minutes, or, I mean, very mundane things that you would say were actually not desperately interesting. But somehow, and it was obviously interesting to me,
of course.
It's probably not very interesting to anybody else. But
well, no,
I mean, there's a style element, and, you know, there was part of the time, but that was quite fun. And so I think that validates that you could easily have dismissed that, saying, well, why on earth would you want to record someone just jumping in and out of a car or playing with a dog or whatever it may be. My father, when he was doing his military service, for example, and, you know, so anyway, so he stitched these pieces together, and actually it was a reminder of, oh, actually that's kind of fun. So it's obviously nostalgic, clearly, but I guess everyone will. It's a human thing.
Someone's into cars will look at that same thing and see it completely differently. They'll see something like, oh my God, I didn't know they had that vehicle. You know, because you said he was in a car driving. Is that what?
Yeah,
I mean, there's so many elements that are
pieces. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that if you didn't have it, maybe certain questions would never be answered or be lost.
Sure.
Who knows what that might be?
Yeah, I mean, perhaps on a more substantial level. I mean, some of the music that your father was involved in, you know, it must be sessions and things with some pretty illustrious performers, of course, and I'm sure.
I'll leave you with one story that pretty much kind of wraps that whole concept up, is that, you know, somebody's in Ronnie Scott's, you know where Ronnie Scott's, London, illegally records a session.
Oh, right. Yeah, of course, yeah.
They illegally record a session inside there, and
right.
many years later that session is discovered and becomes one of the most historical moments taken.
Right, yeah, of course. I think I know the one you're referring to.
You know what I mean? So it's like, you know, I mean, those I mean, that's the whole purpose of this room. Because you know, it may not seem imperative now, even though it is an imperative time, quite imperative, but we don't know what 100 years is going to look like. We don't know what information people are going to need or have or want to have access to that will explain something that may solve an issue or problem or a dilemma or help them just help.
Well, I think that's probably a call to action for me to take some piano lessons before the next time we speak. I don't think I'll have your father's musical credentials to, you know, you've got that, but yeah. So I think, yes, there's lots of things we could talk about, and thank you for the opportunity of
100%.
getting started and getting the ball rolling.
100%. My pleasure. I'm glad you came. Finally. I know you've been a busy man, but having you in this room it's my pleasure, because I know that it has value, you know, not just the immediate value, but long-term value that, you know, neither one of us can possibly even recognize until it continues, you know. And then anybody else that we have in, you know, for that matter, because, you know, otherwise it's lost. You know, otherwise it's just a conversation that happened between two people that no one ever knows about, you know.
That can be an art piece in itself.
Exactly.
Thank you.
Brother.
Boom.
Brother from another mother. Cool.